fiends, friends, and familiars. This is your old pal Matt Orozco from Macabre Daily, and I am so excited to be joined by Kier-La Janisse, who is I'm just going to run through your bio real quick because I had to type up a paragraph for this. It's pretty extensive. You're an author, critic, film programmer, podcaster, publisher, and producer with an emphasis on genre cinema. And you've probably seen her work as a film writer, producer, and publisher and acquisitions executive for Severin Films, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and your new box set, All the Haunts Be Ours Vol.2. But you're also an adjunct professor in the School of Communications and Creative Arts at Deakin University. And Kier-La, I am just so excited to have this conversation with you. So thank you for making the time.
Thank you.
Well, I know we don't have all the time in the world, so I'm going to keep my questions rapid fire. But the first one is in the accompanying storybook for the second volume, you mentioned that the remit you gave to the writer was to create a piece of new short fiction that explores the minutia of real folk customs. Would you say that the films in this volume also represent an emphasis on that same minutia in folk horror? Why or why not?
Um, I would say that some of them do, like definitely the first film in the box set, which is Sean Hogan's To Fire You Come at Last, which is also going to be the first film in our new series that we just announced on for Shudder.
The January or the December haunting season, is that what it is?
The Haunted Season, yeah.
Haunted season.
Um, so that Sean was actually given the same remit when we commissioned the film from him. So that one definitely has that because it's very focused on the sort of practicalities of transporting a corpse over a corpse road. But it's not it's much more focused on that than it is focused on the spectacle, you know. And but I would say, I don't know, it's kind of a mix because there's definitely films like Born of Fire that have massive spectacle, you know. But I do think that I am interested in the processes, you know, like I am interested in what happens during the day as they prepare for the ritual later that night that's going to be like the Wicker Man or whatever, you know, like I'm really
The
interested
pre-planning.
in like the planning, you know, like what does the banality of this look like for the people who actually live in it and practice it, you know? But I don't know. It's interesting because many of these films I watched either a very long time ago, or if I watched them again as part of this process, then you know, I was watching them kind of distant from each other, you know, but I think people who are watching the box set and who are actually kind of diving in and watching a bunch of the films together in a shorter or more concentrated period of time are picking up on connections between them that were probably subconscious connections for me. Somebody previously that I spoke to referred to it as a kindler, gentler version of the previous box set. And so that makes me wonder about your question. I was just like, wow, is it? Like, am I focused more, like less on the spectacle and more on the process in this version of the box set? It's very possible that I was, you know.
I mean, I would say so because I even have it on here as another question, that there is kind of a difference between the first volume and the second one, not just regionality wise. Obviously, the first volume has a lot of Western European influence, but the second one tends to be more global with an emphasis on Asia, the Middle East,
Mhm.
seeing representation from South Korea and Thailand, which I've never seen a South Korean folk horror movie.
Yeah.
So, aside from the rights and availability difficulties that come with sourcing these films and also the quality of masters, what other kinds of challenges do you facing when you're coming up with programming a box set like one like this?
I mean, there's definitely things like people don't think their movie is a folk horror movie or don't think it's a horror movie at all. We did try to get the Jan Spankmeyer movie Little Otik, and that was what his response was his film is not a horror movie. And I was like,
You
pretty
may
sure
not
it's
think
a
that.
horror movie, but yeah, he just didn't want to be associated with the term horror or folk horror or anything. And you do get a lot of directors who do not understand that designation for their work. And some of them are open to it, like the Carter Lord, who made the movie The Enchanted, was like, I never thought of my film as a horror film, but if you think it's a horror film, great. You know? But then you have other people who have the opposite response, who are like, I don't want to be associated with that. So that's kind of the biggest thing, is like people not really understanding the potential of different audiences for their films. It was the same with, we had actually licensed the movie Red Shift, which was written by Alan Garner for the BBC. And we were so excited about that. But the BBC had a clause in their contract with him where he had approval on like where they licensed it. And it was the same response from him, where he did not see it as horror. He did not see it as folk horror. I tried to counter that. Look at all the folk horror books and essays where Red Shift has been mentioned. Like, I mean, clearly it is received this way, even if this was not your intention. And it doesn't take away from any other audience for your film. It's just that it has this additional audience in horror. And yeah, no, didn't want to have anything to do with it. So we had to let that film go. But so that is a big challenge, is people being uncomfortable with the word horror at all, like just they have a really specific idea in their head of what horror is and what that term means. And if their film doesn't have a body count or doesn't have a slasher element to it, they don't understand why it would be considered a horror film, because that's what they think a horror film is. And so, yeah, so overcoming some of those prejudices against the genre, I would say, is the biggest challenge, outside of like just, finding the rights and the materials and stuff.
Yeah, it's almost that. I mean, I operate in a very biased world of a kind of genre film. So I don't, I've kind of been aware of the idea that horror as a genre has value and worth for a very long time, but it sounds like there's still that stigma around the term. Even just putting, horror at the end of folk, right, kind of causes some people to recoil a little bit. And so it's interesting here that some folks weren't, was there anyone that you did convince that this is folk horror and they're like, oh, you're right. I do want it included now.
Well, Carter Lord, who I mentioned previously, probably Jamil Delavi, who made Born of Fire.
Really?
Yeah, and his filmography is so interesting because I feel like Born of Fire is the one film of his that you can easily classify as a specific genre. I'm like, this film clearly fits within the realm of horror, whereas many of his other films are very hard to pin down what genre they would be. He's such a unique filmmaker. But I felt like Born of Fire is the one that's kind of like the hook. It's the one where you could grasp it more easily, like what it is. But it's still very dense with mythology that a lot of Westerners are not familiar with. And so there's still tons to like dig into. It is not a conventional horror film by any means. It's just that it has the most obvious horror like elements to it that you can say like, okay, yes, that's an identifiable thing that I would associate with horror. But he was fine with the term. He was like, I'm fine with however, if that's how you see my film and that's how you want to market it, great. He's like, that's not like what I was thinking when I made it, but that's fine. So yeah, so that's one. And then there's there's lots of the films, if they're older, where we're not dealing with the filmmakers. So something like The White Reindeer, I have no idea what the director, I'm assuming the director thought of it as a horror film because I'm pretty sure it was marketed as a horror film in Finland at the time, but this is in the 50s, so we don't have access to him to know what he was thinking when he made it. But yeah, I would say many of the films really cross genres in this set. They are not just horror, they are also something else. Like you could call them a different genre and people would be like, yeah, that makes sense, but also if you call them horror, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense too. So yeah, so there's like Nang Nak, the Thai film, which is like a horror, but it's also like a love story, and it's
more love story than horror even.
Yeah, like there's a lot of the one thing about Nang Nak that always gets me is how much she cries in the movie. It kind of drives me nuts a little bit. but it's also such a famous story that's been adapted so many times. And I do think this is the strongest version of Nang Nak, and it was definitely the most influential. It was hugely influential in Thailand. It like pretty much single-handedly revitalized the Thai film industry. So it was a really important film. And of course, on the Blu-ray box set, we have like all kinds of contextual extras. There's an interview with the director, and there's a commentary with Cassia and Kuta and Maddie Doe. Maddie Doe is a filmmaker from that region. She's not from Thailand, but she's from Laos. But you know, very, very familiar. Grew up with the Mainak folklore and stuff. And then Cassia and Kuta is one of the preeminent scholars on Thai horror film and genre film, you know. So the two of them do a commentary for the film on the disc that gives a lot of context about the story too.
Yeah, this is, I mean, supremely rich with features is this box set is the best way to describe it. And I know I'll be going back to it quite a bit because there's a lot of short films you've included this time around that I was really excited to see because we don't often appreciate short films as much because it's hard to get distribution for them. It's hard to get them seen unless you're going to film festivals. And I really love that you mentioned the more pedestrian elements. I think to some extent, if I had to kind of classify the kind of folk horror in this set, it's very much focused on the pedestrian, right? Almost the same remit as they gave to the writers. In films like Psychomania, for example, did you receive any sort of pushback on defending that as a folk horror film, especially considering how it fits so oddly into this kind of 60s, 70s, post-hippie counterculture movement?
Yeah. I mean, definitely not. People generally, like, especially if you ask anyone British, they'll classify Psychomania as a folk horror movie. Just because it's got the standing stones, is a huge part of it. Obviously, you can have an occult movie that's not a folk horror movie. But the fact that there's standing stones and there's rituals around the standing stones are very associated with like folk mythology and stuff like that. So the fact that it has all these sequences in the stone circles, that imagery automatically kind of puts it in the folk horror realm, but it's also a juvenile delinquent biker movie, so
Right.
it's like people who just like biker movies love that movie and would never even think of it as like a folk horror movie, but that's one of the things I love about how fluid the genre is. And I don't just mean even just folk horror, but horror in
Yeah.
general, because usually horror films scratch one itch, but they're also scratching some other itch at the same time. You can get very sad movies that are horror movies, and very funny movies that are horror movies, and action-packed movies that are horror movies, and all these different types of things. I mean, it's why the horror community is so broad, and there's so many. I don't know. I feel like the horror community, like people, the horror fandom is so rich and diverse, like because they're so they are really
It's niches now,
I
right?
don't
It's
know,
like people are very much into some people like really like Italian horror, right? And so
yeah,
there's an emphasis there. People really like Asian extreme cinema, right? Even going back to the category 3 films and things like that. So it almost as
yeah,
if it does seem as if there is like horror is the only genre that includes another genre by default, right? Like a straight
yeah,
up horror movie has to have something else, whereas you can have a straight up action movie that doesn't
yeah,
have any real dramatic elements, or any sort of comedy. So it does kind of rely on other genres to put itself in place, but at the same time, the way you've kind of, even talking about folk horror, like it is so broad and vast. And even someone who's immersed in genre as you are, is there anything that you learned about folk horror as you were going through this process of discovering films, programming them for this, and writing about them?
I mean, I would say mostly like when I was making the documentary, Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, so both of these box sets kind of grew out of that documentary. And when I went into the documentary, I had one idea of what folk horror was. And by the end of the movie, I had a different idea of what folk horror was. And so I don't know that my opinion has changed drastically over the last 3 years of working on the box set as much as it changed drastically while I was making that documentary. And what that came down to was that there really appeared to be this split in what people thought folk horror was, between folk horror as a horror film dealing with folklore, folkloric creatures, folkloric elements, and then other people who thought that folk horror was really about the folk. It was about people who like live in some isolated community that have developed a skewed belief system that manifests violently somehow by the end of the film. And
No
so
Island.
when I was interviewing people for the documentary, it was like they would answer, I would, because that was my first question for everybody. What do you think folk horror is? And it was really split, like between what type of folk horror, how they would define what folk horror was. And when I sort of looked at the films they would use as examples of like what they think is a folk horror movie, it seemed to really be geographical. It seemed to be that Anglo-centric folk horror movies, which means British, American, Australian, tended to be the type of folk horror where you have the weird people in the isolated community. The protagonist of the film comes from outside of that community, and they somehow wind up in this village, and they're like, oh my God, all these people are crazy. And then they have to fight for their life against these people. And then a lot of the other parts of the world, the emphasis was much more on folkloric creatures, like sirens and mermaids, for example, or werewolves or shapeshifters, and the folk beliefs that the people had in the movie were usually coming from the protagonists. The protagonists would be a part of the community that had these beliefs, and their beliefs were what they would use to fight against the folkloric creatures. So basically you have one type of folk horror where having the folk beliefs is good, and the other type of folk horror where having the folk beliefs is bad. And I just thought it was very telling that the type of folk horror where the beliefs are bad was Anglo-centric folk horror, where they have colonized other places around the world and they have come into contact with older cultures. And so I was like, this is the type of folk horror that gets created from that kind of mind.
The other kind of
From the
stuff.
kind of mentality where it's like you go somewhere new and there's all these weird people who believe something different from you, and so you have like, even in Brazil, sometimes because there's a lot of colonization in Brazil, so you'll get these kinds of stories and stuff. And it's not cut and dry. It's not like in Asia, they don't have stories like that, because even EO Island, which is like on the box set, does have the story of like the guy a guy from the city going to an island, and there's an island of weird women,
Yep.
So it's not as though those dividing lines are strict by any means, but it was just kind of like these patterns I noticed as I interviewed people, and I thought that was really interesting. But I also just never, so that was kind of the biggest learning thing for me, and then also what Adam Scovell says at the end of my documentary, where he says folk horror is not really a genre, it's more like a mode.
Yeah.
And this is why you can have films in the same conversation that normally people wouldn't consider being the same kind of films, So a film like Panda's Fan and a film like The Wicker Man at some point may not have been considered films that had things in common. But as soon as you apply this umbrella term of folk horror to all these things, you can see commonalities with them. You can see why they would fit into that category or whatever. But again, most folk horror films are also something else at the same time, and to go back to your point about what we were talking about earlier about these genre definitions and stuff. I mean, like, and how you were also saying that like in horror, there's also horror paired with something else, and it's like, and it's really because like in horror, the horror is how the movie deals with the problem, but the problem itself is usually the same type of problem that people in other genres are dealing with, right? But some people deal with that problem through comedy, and some people deal with it through action, so in a horror movie, you'll have the same problem that a Mike Lee movie or a Ken Loach movie, you know, like some social realist movie that's dealing with poverty or a domestic violence situation or something like this. The horror movie will be dealing with the exact same thing. It's just that everything is amped up. Everything
Right.
is exaggerated to the level of like a supernatural threat or what, you know, but the actual problem, whether it's like those problems or like grief is a huge one in horror, you know. It's like everything is just hyper magnified, you know, and that is how horror, it's just it refuses to like let there be an elephant in the room or have there be something that's not talked about. It's like, no, we are going to talk about this in the most loud and aggressive way possible, you know? And so the movie is still about all those same things. It's about the personal experience of violence or heartbreak or loss or whatever, but it's just that it's like this is the lens that we're going to look at this problem through. And this is why so many people talk about horror as being a cathartic genre for them on so many levels, because it really will not shy away from the questions that other genres deal with, like really delicately, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it almost makes me think, that, as you're saying, like the difference between horror and just another genre and separate genre is how hard it goes into, it leans into the horror. It's almost like Panic Room isn't a horror movie, but The Strangers is a horror movie because it adds masks, right? And it makes it more
Right.
malevolent as opposed to the focus on money. It's more like, well, we just want to mess
Yeah.
with you. So it is like that kind of change in context that really makes it, and also elevating the parts that are more maybe bombastic or out of this world to really sell that. And you've I think to your credit and the credit of everyone you worked with on this box set, folks that are watching that through and through are likely, hopefully like myself, having a revisitation of films that they've watched and thinking, wow, is that folk horror? Because I just watched this
Yeah.
Radiance box set, the Dai Gothic box set they put out. And those three Japanese films are like could fit so well into this box set because they deal
Yes,
with
one
very
of them
similar.
was supposed to be on the box set.
Oh no. I mean, they're
Yeah.
so like
That's
something
a
like
thank you for hitting my sore spot.
oh, was it the Snow Woman? I said
Yes.
okay. I thought that might be the one, but yeah, I think it has caused at least me and I hope others the opportunity to think more broadly about what is folk horror and not
Yeah.
trying to box it into something just because it's either has a mythical creature that has mythology around it, or it has people that are not like everybody else. And it begs the question, I guess you probably get asked this in every interview, are you planning a third box set?
I mean, I am not. The second box set happened really organically, which was that there were movies that we were trying to get for the first box set that we just couldn't get locked down in time, and it didn't look like they were going to be locking up anytime soon. So we had to kind of make the decision to do the box set without them, but we were still in the middle of those negotiations and we didn't want to just be like, okay, well, the box set's done, so we're gonna just forget it. We don't want the movie anymore. We were like, no, we're still gonna try to get that movie. And that became kind of, it automatically just flipped over into a plan to make another box set, you know? So it was like it started off with a few movies that we didn't get in time for the first set. Who Fears the Devil, The Legend of Hillbilly John was one of them, and The Rights of May, the Mike DeLeon film was one of the other ones, you know, that we were trying to get the first time around. Um, and so that was kind of the beginnings of the second box set. And then we were like, well, if we were going to do another box set, in what ways would you improve on the first box set, you know? And so for me, it was like reaching out a bit more globally, like hitting some regions that we didn't address either in the previous box set or in the documentary. And then also expanding on the extras. Like I would say the extras for this box set, I would say there's more of them. They're more in depth. There's more production budget behind some of them. Like one of them I even have, like I got an animator to like animate the credits of the of the extra, which is not an expense you would normally take on for an extra, you know, like something hand animated. So there's definitely like more care, I would say. I mean, not to diminish the care that was put into the previous box set,
Sure.
but I would say the care that was put into the extras this time around, it was just like a chance to kind of try to improve on everything from the first box set. Whereas the idea of doing a third box set is not it's not an automatic thing. Like the last time, like I wouldn't say like, oh, there's these holdover movies we didn't get that is going to be the genesis of another box set. So that organic shift to another box set is not there. That I don't want to say like for sure there will never be another box set, because if it turns out there's a whole bunch of movies that I'm super enthusiastic about that do not have distribution in other places, then yes, maybe another box set will materialize, but it's definitely not my focus right now. So right now I have, like, for Severin, I've got other box sets coming up that I'm working on. And I also have another documentary that I'm making for Severin, which is the adaptation of David Korekis and David Slater's book, Killing for Culture.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, so I don't know if you have ever read that book, but it was a
Heard of
hugely
it. Never
influential
read it.
book to me and to many other scholars. It originally came out in 1994 from like Creation Books, which used to be this like small, and from what I've heard from people, sketchy label that so it was on, I think it was on that label originally. And then David Korekis, he has his own publishing imprint called Head Press. And so I think he got the rights to the book back, and so it's been available from Head Press ever since then. But it's, hugely important book about the Mondo film, the sort of faces of death type films, and many of the philosophical questions around these kinds of films, And so I am making a film adaptation of that movie, or of that book. And it's a super heavy and grim topic. And so it's not going to be turned around very quickly. There's a lot of stuff I have to spend a lot of time like mulling over, like what I already kind of know what my thesis is, but it's more, I want to make it a bit more stylistic than my previous movie. I mean, my previous movie is stylistic, but largely because thanks to like the animators and stuff, people that I got to work on it. But the interviews themselves, we sort of shot the same way that we do all our extras, which is like you find a camera person who's local to whoever you want to interview, and you hire them to interview that person. But what that means is that every interview looks totally different. It's like the lighting is different, the direction they're looking is different. I mean, even if you give people guidelines, it's inevitably going to be different, and it's hard to get the footage to match. And luckily, nobody really commented on that when my documentary came out. So luckily all the, what people were talking about was interesting enough that people weren't noticing the technical limitations. But that's something I definitely want to improve for my second film, is trying to make those interview environments a bit more deliberate.
I mean,
So
between you and David Gregory, there's just, I mean, film documentaries are kind of like my catnip. So
yeah,
the more you keep putting out of that stuff, the more I'm going to keep watching it.
yeah.
I even know you've included David Gregory's Susanna
Oh
documentary
yeah.
as well. And I just want to show everyone the box set, to see, make sure they haven't seen it. But also, I think if you're going to continue this in any shape or form, I think this might be the secret. This kind of golden books, little golden books kind of look on it. And especially the We Are Phil story had me like cackling and then kind of scared a
Okay.
little bit. I'm like, oh wow, this is getting a little weird, but it's still very good.
Yeah.
And even Kim Newman's story is just kind of a little out there, but very interesting. So for
Yeah.
what it's worth, I think that is a fantastic avenue to continue this folk horror tradition, because there's
Yeah.
so many great stories in there that I think one are just so fun, but they're also so normal. Like just
Yeah.
like people really understand climate.
I liked that so we announced yesterday that we're doing this series on Shudder, which is like an annual sort of winter's tales, or I don't want to say ghost stories for Christmas, because I don't want to limit it to Christmas culturally, but it is that type of a series, where it's like every December we'll have a new ghost story or a new horror story, kind of in that same vein as the BBC Ghost Stories, which means it's a bit more restrained and very underlit and moody and atmospheric and very literary in tone. And when I was reading some of those stories in that book, I was like, oh, some of these would make really great
Yeah.
short films, you know. I was like, I wonder if we could somehow be responsible for expanding some of these films or these stories into films, you know. Because yes, that was some of them are very cinematic too. So
Yeah, and they're just, I mean, I think one thing that we don't, I don't think folk horror is gone per se, but I think we don't always think about our modern life in terms of folk traditions. So like even the something as benign as, checking our social media has become some of a folk ritual in our digital age, right? Is like, how do we go
yeah,
about checking our social media? We now have habits. I'm like, oh, we only do it this many times a day, or we only spend this, we don't do it an hour before bed. So we are building up these traditions that kind of
yeah,
how we relate to our world and our reality. And even
yeah.
so, seeing more modern representation of folk horror, I'd be curious to know if you have any ideas on modern films that you think would fit nicely into maybe in the not in the 90s to current day box set,
Well, it's I don't know because the folk horror films I'm thinking of that are sort of more recent are still very much like
like
folk
The
horror
Witch
films,
kind of thing.
you know. So I'm like thinking of like I don't know if you saw The Last Sacrifice, which I mean it's a documentary, but it played at
No.
the Brooklyn Horror Fest and it played at Beyond Fest in LA. I think it's just doing its festival run right now, so I don't think a lot of people have seen it yet. But it's a folk horror documentary, but totally different from mine in that it's very focused on a specific murder case, and so it's like a folk horror film, a true crime film, and like an occult history film all in one, but like beautifully psychedelically edited and stuff. Like, and it's directed by Rupert Russell, who is the son of Ken Russell, who is like
No
one of the
way.
greatest directors who ever lived. So that is a movie I would highly recommend checking out. Um, but yeah, the a lot of the stuff about urban life and its relationship, like modern urban life and its relationship to folk horror, this has been a bit of a stumbling block for me, I think, and because it came up in the documentary when people would talk about Candyman. Because
Yeah.
like Candyman was not a film I would have considered it. I would have considered it as a folk horror film in the sense of like related to folklore and stuff like this. But many people mentioned it in their, when in their interviews. And uh, but the predominant belief about folk horror was that it takes place in a rural environment. So I was like, okay, so Candyman is clearly transgressing that because it's taking place in like the most urban
Yeah,
environment that you
Chicago.
can think of, which is like a housing project in the middle of Chicago. So how does that then blast the doors open in terms of what we can call folk horror? And because so many people do consider it a rural phenomena. So it's not something that I've been able to put tons of time into thinking about, but it is something that I think is going to be explored a lot more in film. I mean, like often writers will refer to that as like urban weird with a Y, like urban weird instead of folk horror. Um, because it's like basically got all the elements of folk horror, but it's urban. And so yeah, so some people refer to more modern stories dealing with those things, like modern urban stories as urban weird. But I think because of the discussions around Candyman, it really does open it up to like, well, what does folk horror look like when it's in the city or in an apartment, or in these kind of like day-to-day urban environments that many people live in now. So I think we are going to actually there probably is an academic book on this exact topic because usually there are academic books like several years before people start really making films on those topics in abundance. But I think it's something that people are going to start exploring a lot more. Like, what does that term mean when you put it in this context?
Especially since we live in such a global society now where we aren't so much restrained by as many boundaries, and we have
Yeah.
very much a salad bowl experience of living in a country where, at least here in North America, people come from all over, and that kind of transientness is kind of expands across the globe. So that also affects our traditions, our rituals, adapts them in a
Yeah.
way. So I think you're right. There's a lot to explore there, but it is kind of a big, meaty topic that requires probably a lot
Yeah.
of discernment. So Kayla, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this time and this conversation, and to remind everyone to please go pick up all the Haunts BRs Volume 2. I'm super excited for what you all are working on with the haunted season, as well as the kind of Mondo Face of Death, because that is such an interesting part of our culture, that is
Yeah,
still persists today in a very nefarious way, but also informs the films we love. So,
yeah.
Kayla, thank you so much for this time, and can't wait to see what's next.
No problem. Thanks a lot.
Bye bye.